Fremantle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased to speak on the budget without as much preparation as perhaps I would like. It's a budget that doesn't know whether it's Arthur or Martha. The previous speaker, the member for Fairfax, has talked about the government's fiscal objectives, the way that it seeks to get back on some sort of responsible fiscal track. The projected surplus in the early years of the 2020s is minimal, to say the least. I guess we're going to see whether the government's able to achieve that. The reality is that since coming to government in 2013, on the back of what was described as a debt emergency, we haven't seen any significant change in a positive direction as far as debt's concerned. In fact, we've seen debt blow out extraordinarily. The government talked at that time as if we were on the brink of some sort of fiscal apocalypse. Things have only got worse, and they've got worse in both directions. The government hasn't controlled spending, and it hasn't taken advantage of the opposition's preparedness to look at sensible revenue measures. For Western Australia, this is a budget of great disappointment. You know, this is a government that claimed under former Prime Minister Tony Abbott to be a government focused on infrastructure. I think Prime Minister Abbott described himself as seeking to be the infrastructure Prime Minister. In the government's best year, as far as infrastructure spending is concerned, it has fallen below what the Labor Party delivered in its lowest year. And nowhere is that more clear than in Western Australia. The budget does not provide one new dollar in infrastructure spending for Western Australia. What we have been able to achieve, and it really is something that the Western Australian community has achieved, is the return of $1.2 billion which were allocated to the Perth Freight Link and sort of held over the people of Western Australia almost in a sort of a fiscal hostage kind of manoeuvre. For a number of years we were told it was $1.2 billion for the Perth Freight Link or nothing, a project that was born out of the 2014 budget, the new Abbott government's first budget, a project that Western Australia had never asked for, a project that was not assessed by Infrastructure Australia until after it had been proposed, that had no environmental approvals, that had no detail beyond Stock Road, a project that would have done irreparable damage to precious wetlands in my community. Now, we were told over and over again that it was $1.2 billion for that project or nothing. Of course, as I remarked the other day, it's funny what an election will achieve. We've seen a stark demonstration of the will of the people of Western Australia in relation to that project, in relation to policy in my state across the board, and despite the threats by the Minister for Urban Infrastructure that those funds would not be forthcoming to a Western Australian state government for projects that Western Australians had determined were of importance to them, lo and behold, those funds have been handed over. And we're glad about that. So in my electorate, that includes projects like the Community Connect South project, which is the duplication of Armidale Road and the building of the North Lake Road Bridge. Involves the widening of the freeway northbound from Russell Road. It involves the fixing up of the High Street Stirling Highway intersection and the stretch of High Street west of Carrington Street. All of these projects have been identified by the incoming WA Labor government. They were campaigned on by me and by my colleague, the member for Burt, and I'm grateful to see that they will be delivered. But that is money that was allocated as far back as the 2014 budget. And in fact, in the case of the upgrade of the High Street Stirling Highway intersection, those funds were allocated by the federal Labor government in 2008. So I know the member for Tagney was in here the other day kind of banging on about why that project had taken so long. It took so long because between 2008 and the election earlier this year, the Barnett government did nothing about it. So something will occur now, and that's fantastic. Instead of seeing any new funds in infrastructure, which we desperately need, what the government has done, I can only assume under advice of coalition members from Western Australia, is it's put $1.2 billion in the budget papers as a contingent liability for whichever next government might come along and deliver on the Perth Freight Link. You can imagine how that has gone down in Western Australia. That has gone down like a lime and sulphur scone. I mean, we are not getting any new money for infrastructure, and instead $1.2 billion is sort of put there as a contingent liability for this ridiculous project that should never have been conceived and will never be proceeded with. I don't know what it's contingent on. It might be contingent on the member for Tangney inventing a time machine, or the people of Western Australia falling under a kind of cloud of delusion, the likes of which seems to have bound up the coalition members from Western Australia. Those conditions are not ever going to come about, but it is bitter in the extreme to have $1.2 billion of funds which we desperately need to address productivity obstacles or productivity blockages, and to address the severe unemployment in Western Australia. We have recently had the highest unemployment in the country. Western Australia, like most of Australia, is currently experiencing the highest underemployment on record. Madam Deputy Speaker, the budget is disappointing in a number of other key areas. It's particularly disappointing in education. Western Australia exists in a slightly anomalous position with regards to education, because the former Barnett government was not interested in being part of needs-based funding, and it struck its own deal. So it's harder to assess what's going on in Western Australia compared to the rest of the country, where the Labor government came to arrangements with state governments about needs-based funding over a period of time. We can now see that under the government's Gonski 2.0 or 2.0, as the member for Fairfax called it, that Australian schools will be $22 billion less over 10 years. They will be on average $2.4 million less per school. In Western Australia, the situation is bleak in a different way. The Barnett government struck its own deal with the Abbott-Turnbull government, and it carried the basis of that funding deal in its own budget papers. So the Barnett government knew that for the next 4 years it needed to have a figure based on what it expected the negotiation with the Commonwealth to deliver. And what that means is that there is a $650 million gap in Western Australia over the next 4 years. Now, that's not a gap between what Labor would have delivered, what a federal Labor government would have delivered. That's a gap between what the Barnett government carried in its budget papers and what the current Turnbull government is going to give to WA. So that's a $650 million black hole, and it will mean that education for kids in my electorate, support for teachers in my electorate, is less than what it should be. I'm the son of a teacher. My mum is 70 years old. She continues to work teaching special needs kids. That's an area where you really see how needs-based assistance can make a difference. As most representatives would know, our schools vary. You know, our school education system compared to many other countries is a good one, but there's a great variance in primary and high schools across our electorates, generally related to socio-economic circumstances. So I can go, as I did at the end of last year and recently in relation to Anzac Day services, I can go to school after school and get a sense of how the challenges are different, the capital resources are different, and the needs are different. And that's what needs-based funding is all about. But the current sort of proposition put forward by the government as far as funding is not going to get us to where we need to be. It's not going to get us to the point where inequality and disadvantage is being addressed through needs-based funding, so that that sort of intergenerational disadvantage doesn't continue, and children who grow up facing disadvantage, whether it's socio-economic or whether it's because they live with a disability, actually have the greatest possible opportunity to be involved in social and economic life in this country. Madam Deputy Speaker, I was in the chamber earlier and the Treasurer was introducing the bills to do with the Medicare levy. I think it is cynical in the extreme for the government to tie its approach to the Medicare levy to the full funding of the NDIS. It's invidious for people who have waited for the NDIS for a long time, a great Labor reform. It's invidious for them to be caught up in this kind of debate. The reality is that any government has the ability out of consolidated revenue to support the programs it wants to support in the way it wants to support them. The government is giving $65 billion away in tax cuts. That's its choice. That's its program. It can make that argument. But if it chose to give away a bit less of that money at a time when a program like the NDIS is being settled in, that funding would be available without recourse to the Medicare levy in the way that the government proposes to pursue it. That's a choice. So I think tying those things together is essentially a political manoeuvre, and I think that's a shame. I guess I conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, by just looking at the kind of narrative that the government has tried to introduce around this budget, which is essentially to look at some of the big reforms that Labor secured in its last government, things like needs-based funding, things like the NDIS. And it's trying two kinds of slipperiness. The first is to suggest that these things were always going to happen, that we all agreed about them and they were always going to happen. And that's rubbish. Labor governments come in and they make change. In the last government, we introduced the NDIS, we introduced needs-based funding, we introduced the NBN, we introduced an approach to deal with climate change. Those four things alone are more significant and more momentous than anything a coalition government has done in living memory. The people in this place like to look back at the time between 1996 and 2007 as a kind of a golden era of coalition government. What did those 11 years produce? The GST. The GST. Well, if you're behind the wheel of an economy that was set up by the reforms, the profound economic reforms of the Hawke Keating government, there's no great surprise that you reap the benefits. But what was done with those benefits? Nothing. So a Labor government comes in a relatively short time, too short. We introduced reforms to deal with some of the biggest challenges facing this country: the NDIS, the NBN, an economy-wide program to tackle climate change, and needs-based funding. So now we have a coalition government which pretends that it was always on board with those things, that those things were always going to happen, and that is rubbish. And then it pretends that but for their excellent administrative capacity and funding know-how, those things wouldn't have happened, and that is rubbish too. So what we can't have in this country as we go forward, because those challenges are being settled, they're going to take a Labor government to put them right, but there are further challenges ahead, and we can't keep having this misconception perpetrated upon the Australian public. There are great challenges in this nation. Labor does what it can and has done, I think, a remarkable job in recent times of tackling some of those enormous areas, but we can't then spend 4 years, 5 years, 6 years spinning our wheels, indulging in political game playing, trying to sort of shark the credit of the things that Labor governments have done, try to muddy the waters with facile and insubstantial arguments about money. We need to focus on the big picture, and I'm sorry that this budget is more smoke and mirrors than it could have been. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.